Hi all. Your last question for the Superpower Relations paper, question 4, will look something like this. We're going to look over how to answer this in this video. So, 4 things I'm going to go through. What is it that the question's looking for? How do we actually answer this question? What questions have come up before for the 16 marker? Can we see any patterns? And finally, how can we use this to plan our revision? What can we expect to see in the exam? How can we prepare for the worst case situation? So, first of all, what is this question looking for? And you can see here I've highlighted the stem of the question in peach, and in yellow I've highlighted the bits that might change. So here we've got our event, the Truman Doctrine. We've got our time period 45 to 49. There tends to be 3 periods that I'll talk about: 45 to 49, 50s or 60s. We'll talk about that a bit more later on. So the examiner is looking for the following for a high level 4 answer to get 12 to 16 marks out of 16. First of all, you should be able to explain what happens in the factor in the question and why it caused tension. And that's a key bit here. We need to really be able to talk about the event that they mention, otherwise we can't get high marks. We also always need to be able to talk about tension as well. Why did it make things worse? We need to show our examiner a range of accurate, relevant and detailed knowledge, and that includes events relevant to the time period that aren't mentioned in the question. We need a clear line of reasoning throughout the answer. We need to decide early if the Truman Doctrine was the main reason for tension or if it was something else. We need to be consistent with that in our answer. And finally, we need a conclusion at the end, a well-judged conclusion. Was this the main reason for tension? If so, why? If not, why was it something else? So we're looking at doing these things in this answer. So, how do we answer this question? Well, the first thing I'd always encourage you to do is just spend 30 seconds to plan out. Don't just write into it straight away. Take the time, do a rough plan, get it clear in your head which side of the argument you're going to be on here. So, for agree with the Truman Doctrine, well, we could talk about the following: that it meant the USA was now heavily involved in Europe and this angered the USSR. And as a result, the Truman Doctrine meant that America was more involved in Europe, and that led to involvements in this time period with events such as the Berlin blockade due to containing communism. But you could also argue that other events caused more tension from 45 to 49 as well. Now, if we look at our exam spec, and this is in revision guide 1 that I gave you before, any of these could come up really for part 1. These are all 45 to 49. So you could bring up any of these key ideas at all here. It gets a bit messier with part 2 isn't quite all 1950s and part 3 isn't quite all 1960s. We'll talk about that a bit more later on. But any of these could be used really to talk about increased tension. So from the spec, I'm going to talk about the Marshall Plan, because that stopped the USSR spreading communism and increased the divide in Europe. I'm going to talk about the Berlin blockade as well, the first flashpoint in a Cold War where they could have actually gone to war directly. And it showed really they're no longer allies at that point. That's the final straw. You might be tempted to talk about a whole range of ideas here. Just do a maximum of 2. You only need one other event really that's not in the question. I like to have a second just in case there's a backup, in case the first one's gone a bit wrong. We've got something to fall back on. So that's our plan. And I'm going to say that actually the Truman Doctrine did cause the most tension because it led to these other events happening later on. So, we've got our plan here. You could have either option. So you could have gone for disagree as well. There's no correct answer. It's just how you argue it. I would start my answer off like this, and I would write an introduction. I wouldn't spend ages on the introduction. I don't want to put a load of waffle in there, but I would just start off with something like, I strongly agree with the statement. I believe the Truman Doctrine was the main reason for increased tension between the superpowers from 45 to 49. You can see that tight focus on the question there, because it changed US foreign policy and it made the USA actively involved in stopping the spread of communism. It's not a waffly introduction. I've got 2 sentences there. It gets my examiner's attention with that phrase, I strongly agree, straight away. But I've got to make sure I always strongly agree with the statement that always showed that the Truman Doctrine was the main reason for tension. Now, we're going to write our TEAL paragraphs. We've spoken about this in class before. TEAL, the T stands for theme. What's your paragraph about? That's only going to be a sentence or 2 maximum. It just sets the paragraph up. We're going to make it as broad as we can. We then bring in our evidence. This is our historic knowledge on what happened during the events. This isn't the main focus of the question, though. We don't want to get too hung up on this one. Just 3 sentences or so of precise information will be enough. Because the main focus of the paragraph is explaining. How does this help us answer the question? Why does this cause tension? And this should be the largest part of the paragraph because it's what the question wants. And then we're linking back at the end. We're concluding the paragraph just by linking back. Therefore, we just sum up what we've discussed in the paragraph. So here's my theme. The Truman Doctrine was the main reason for increased tension. You can see I've highlighted that, focused on the question, because it showed the USA were now openly committed to containment. I now need to talk about what the Truman Doctrine was, bit of historical knowledge. It was announced on the 12th of March 1947. If you don't remember the precise date, that's fine, you can just put 1947. When President Truman told Congress the USA would support countries at risk of becoming communist. This meant the USA would provide help such as money, supplies, or military support to stop communism spreading further. I'm not writing too much here. This isn't a narrative question. This is focused on tension. So we move on to that with the explain. Why is this causing tension? And look at that sentence starter. I'm making it clear I've got that focus to my examiner. This increased tension because, and now I'm going into the detail, Stalin saw it as a direct challenge to the USSR. He believed the USA was interfering in other countries and trying to weaken Soviet influence. This was especially threatening because the USSR wanted a buffer zone in Eastern Europe after the damage it suffered in the Second World War. The Truman Doctrine made Stalin believe the USA was trying to surround the USSR with capitalist countries and limit Soviet security. It also made the Cold War more serious because the USA and USSR were now openly following opposite policies. The USA wanted to contain communism, while the USSR wanted to protect and expand its influence. Finally, we're linking back, and again, we're not writing much. It's just to sum the paragraph up what we've written about. Therefore, the Truman Doctrine was the main reason for increased tension because it moved the USA away from isolationism and towards active opposition to the USSR. So, our paragraph looks a bit like this. You can see I've got the theme highlighted here. Then I've got the evidence. Then we've got the explain. That's the main part we've got there of the paragraph. And then we're linking back at the ends. So, this is the start of our answer. But the exam spec says, give a range of accurate, relevant and detailed knowledge. We've not really given a range here. We've shown we know a lot about the Truman Doctrine, but not about other events. At the moment, we're in level 2, 8 marks maximum. We need to move into the higher levels by talking about other events from that time period. And that's what we've got in our plan. We're going to talk about the disagree section. Now, as I said before, you might be tempted, I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 ideas here. Don't do that. Just do 2 events really well. The examiners are looking for 2 events in detail maximum. You don't have time to do a lot of events and you'll do them too briefly. So, we start off with the Marshall Aids, and look how I've started that paragraph off. Some people might disagree and argue, so I'm acknowledging there's another side to the argument, but I'm basically still saying it was the Truman Doctrine. That Marshall Aid was the main reason for increased tension. Marshall Aid was announced in June 1947 when George Marshall offered financial support to help European countries recover after the Second World War. Europe had been badly damaged by the war, and the USA believed that poverty and instability would make countries more likely to turn to communism. About $13 billion was given to European countries. And then we've got our focus here. We're focusing back on the question. This increased tension because Stalin believed the USA was using money to spread capitalism and make European countries dependent on America. He also feared that if Eastern European countries accepted the aid, they would move away from Soviet control. As a result, Stalin refused to let countries under Soviet influence accept Marshall Aid, which made the division between Eastern and Western Europe clearer. Now, look at what I'm doing with the next bit. I'm acknowledging Marshall Aid, I've spoken about why it did cause tension, and I'm adding this little bit on here to show a consistent argument. However, the Truman Doctrine caused more tension in Marshall Aid because Marshall Aid was the economic method used to carry out containment. The Truman Doctrine was more important because it first committed the USA to stopping the spread of communism. Now, if I've got time, I'm going to add another event to show a range of knowledge. I also like to have another event just as a backup, just in case I've accidentally spoken about an event that doesn't fit the criteria of the time period. So here we go. Finally, some might argue that the Berlin blockade was the main reason for increased tension because it was the first major direct crisis between the USA and USSR. After the Second World War, Germany and Berlin were divided into zones controlled by the USA, Britain, France, and the USSR. Berlin was inside the Soviet zone, but West Berlin was controlled by the Western Allies. In June 1948, Stalin blocked all road, rail, and canal routes into West Berlin, hoping to force the Western Allies out. This increased tension because the USA and its allies saw the blockade as Soviet aggression and refused to abandon West Berlin. Instead, they launched a Berlin airlift, flying supplies into the city for almost a year. This made the Cold War more dangerous because both sides were directly challenging each other in the same city, creating a risk that the crisis could lead to war. It also made the division between East and West clearer, as the Western Allies became more determined to defend West Berlin, while Stalin became more determined to stop Western influence spreading in the Soviet zone. However, the Truman Doctrine caused more tension in the Berlin blockade because the blockade was a consequence of the growing rivalry between East and West, while the Truman Doctrine was the policy that helped create that rivalry. So here I've said, yeah, the Berlin blockade did cause increased tension, but it wouldn't have happened if the Truman Doctrine hadn't been there first. The Truman Doctrine, that policy of stopping the spread of communism, leads to the Berlin blockade when Stalin tried to take the blockade for himself. Finally, we're looking for a well-judged conclusion here. And don't rush your conclusion. Don't leave just 2 lines and that's it. Let's look at an example. Firstly, I'm going to say why my view is correct, and I'm going to make sure that I'm consistent, like I have been throughout the answer, that it is the Truman Doctrine. Overall, the Truman Doctrine was the main reason for increased tension between the superpowers from 1945 to 1949 because it marked the biggest change in American foreign policy. It showed that the USA had moved away from isolationism and was now openly committed to containment, meaning it would actively try to stop the spread of communism. This directly challenged the USSR because Stalin saw it as the USA trying to weaken Soviet influence and limit Soviet security. So the first bit I've done in this conclusion, I've said why my view is correct, the reasons for my view. To make it a high-level conclusion, I'm now going to acknowledge the other events and why they are not as important, which is what I've done in this answer so far. Martial aid did increase tension because Stalin believed the USA was using money to spread capitalism and make European countries dependent on America. However, it was not the main reason because it was the economic method used to carry out the Truman Doctrine. In other words, martial aid followed from the policy of containment that Truman had already announced. The Berlin blockade also increased tension because it created a direct crisis between the USA and USSR over Berlin. However, it was not the main reason because it was a later consequence of the growing division between East and West. This division had already been made worse by the Truman Doctrine, which openly committed the USA to opposing Soviet influence. So there I've gone. These are the things I talked about. This is why they were not as important. And that really pushes you from a level 3 into a level 4. It's acknowledging other events and go into why they weren't as important. And then just a sentence to conclude and link back. Therefore, the Truman Doctrine was the main reason because it created a policy that led to both martial aid and later crises such as the Berlin blockade. And this way we've ticked off all of the boxes here. We've done all of these things. Our line of reason is so clear throughout. We've always said it's the Truman Doctrine. We've always explained why it was more important than other things. So our answer looks like this. Introduction, the events in the question, another event, and then if we've got time, a third event just to make sure, and then a well-developed conclusion. It's not just 2 lines. We're really explaining our thought process here. So what's come up before? I'm going to put these questions up on the screen for you to have a look at. Notice it tends to be quite big events that they talk about here. And there's 3 time periods, like we said, 45 to 49, 50s and 60s. It tends to be quite straightforward. Just watch out, there's quite a sly question. It's the 4th one down. The main reason for the development of the Cold War in the 50s was the creation of NATO in 1949. Just make sure you are talking about the right time period there. I imagine a lot of students would have seen NATO 1949 and assumed the question was about 45 to 49. So, how can we plan for this answer as a part of your revision? It's such a key question, it's worth so many marks. Well, like I said, if we look at these questions here, 45 to 49, 50s and 60s. So it's very likely that one of those time periods is going to be the question. Let's imagine a worst case scenario here. Instead of the Truman Doctrine, let's say it's something like Comic-Con. A lot of people struggle with Comic-Con. Let's say that this was our question here. Absolute nightmare. Your mind's gone blank, which I'm sure won't happen. What can we do instead? Well, if we go back to our answer that we did earlier, and I've just flipped the opening sentence, that's all I've changed. I strongly disagree with the statement. I believe the Truman Doctrine was the main reason. This is a level 2 answer that you can prepare before the exam. It's worth 5 to 8 marks, and this helps you prepare for that worst case scenario so you're not leaving this blank. So what I would do is I would have an event that I can explain really well from 45 to 49, an event you can explain really well in the 50s, and an event you can explain really well in the 60s. That is the bare minimum before your exam. And if a question comes up you don't know about the event at all, you can talk about the event you do know. Now, obviously, in the ideal world, the more event you should know every event in the spec, and you should be able to talk about it. And the more events you know, the more confident you'll be with these answers. But you cannot afford to leave this blank. Getting 8 marks here will be the difference between you getting a grade or 2 higher than what you would do if you left it blank. So, final reminders for this one. Read the question and underline key information. Check you know about the event in the question, you've understood it. It's not, for example, the Berlin Wall and you write about the Berlin blockade. Check you're writing about the correct time period. It takes 3 seconds just to check it through. Don't waste time on that one. Plan your answer. Don't rush into it. Take your time so your answer is consistent throughout whilst you're writing. It doesn't matter which event you feel was the main reason for tension. Thousands of students will agree with the statement, thousands will disagree and say it was another event. There isn't a correct answer here. It's how well you argue it, it's how consistent you are. Talk about the event in the question if you can. Even if it's a complete nightmare, even if you just write maybe 3 sentences, just bluff your way through it. Don't, ignore that event in the question, because like I said, the most you can get is 8 marks. Do the best you can, try and acknowledge the event in the question, write a bit about it, even if it's a bit of a shocker, because that will help move you into level 3. Bring in another 1 or 2 events from the time period, a maximum of 2. Don't try and write about everything. You have only got about 20 minutes to write this answer. The examiner is looking for good, in-depth knowledge. It is not looking for 2 sentences on 6 events. Don't just describe the event. Don't just describe what the Truman Doctrine was. Don't just describe what Marshall Plan was. Explain what led to increased tension. That's what the question wants. That should be the majority of your paragraph. Think about how it made the other side feel and why. Think about what events it led to. Conclusion, leave time for this. Main reason and why, and be consistent again. If you said in your introduction it was 1 event, make sure your conclusion matches that. Also, for that high-level conclusion, why the other event's not as important. Timing, don't leave this till the last 10 minutes. Leave at least 20 minutes for this question. It's worth so many marks. You might want to think about doing this first if you're confident enough so you can get it out of the way, squared away, and it's a good standard, and then just do the other 4 mark questions later on. But don't run out of time because your answer won't be as good. And then, final reminder, just about the SPAG marks, up to 4 SPAG marks for this one. Capital letters are essential. Germany, capital G, USSR, capital letters, and so on. Make sure we're writing the past tense, correct length of sentences, and this idea of use of terminology. Don't be afraid of the spelling for that. So if you want to put in something like Khrushchev, for example, put Khrushchev down. Don't worry if you spell it incorrectly. You will still get marks for using the correct terminology for the time period. That's it for this one. Best of luck and take care. Bye-bye.